The timing alone stopped people in their tracks. A historic American family stepped forward to announce an unthinkable loss, a young life gone far too soon. The news spread quickly, met with shock, sympathy, and quiet reflection. But just hours later, the moment took a sharp turn. While the family was still processing their grief, a sitting U.S. president was active online, reposting messages that mocked that very same family, reigniting an old feud in the middle of mourning. So the question almost asked itself, was this an unfortunate coincidence, or a calculated message sent at the worst possible moment? Because to understand why this hit so hard, you have to look at what was already brewing behind the scenes. The news hit like a punch to the gut. Tatiana Schlossberg, just 35 years old, was suddenly gone. For many Americans, her last name alone carries generations of history. But Tatiana wasn't just another Kennedy headline. She was the daughter of Caroline Kennedy and the granddaughter of President John F. Kennedy, quietly living under one of the most famous political legacies in the country. Just weeks earlier, Tatiana had publicly revealed she was battling a serious illness, a revelation that already had people holding their breath. Few expected the story to end so soon. When the announcement came, it wasn't wrapped in politics or spectacle. It was raw, personal, and devastating. The family's statement was heartbreakingly simple. They described her as beautiful, loving, and deeply cherished. A mother, a wife, a daughter taken far too early. There were no talking points, no defenses, no arguments, just grief. And while the Kennedy family was sharing that grief with the world, something very different was unfolding online. What made the moment even more jarring was what wasn't said. There was no acknowledgement of the loss, no brief note, no public sympathy. Instead, Trump's Truth Social feed told a completely different story. Within hours, he began reposting messages from MAGA supporters, posts aimed squarely at the Kennedy family. The tone wasn't subtle. It was dismissive, mocking, and openly provocative, portraying the Kennedys as entitled, irrelevant, and undeserving of the legacy attached to their name. By itself, that kind of rhetoric wasn't new. But placed against the backdrop of a family publicly mourning a daughter and mother, the silence on the loss made the reposts feel louder, sharper, almost impossible to ignore. For many watching, it felt less like coincidence and more like a statement made through omission. And those posts weren't random. They were tied to an escalating power struggle that had already been simmering beneath the surface. At the center of all this was a move that had already ignited outrage long before the tragedy. Trump had pushed to add his own name to the Kennedy Center, the iconic Washington, D.C. landmark built as a living memorial to President John F. Kennedy. Almost immediately, the White House framed it as settled business, announcing that the center's board had approved the change with a unanimous vote. And this wasn't just talk. Within days, work crews were already on site, physically altering the building's signage. Trump's name appeared alongside and above JFK's, turning a decades-old memorial into a political flashpoint almost overnight. For many Americans, this wasn't about architecture or branding. It struck a nerve because of what the Kennedy Center represents. It's not just a performance venue. It's a symbol tied directly to a fallen president and a moment frozen in American history. Touching it felt personal. But behind that so-called unanimous vote, insiders were quietly saying something very different happened. That's when the story took a sharper turn. Jack Schlossberg, Tatiana's brother, publicly pushed back on the White House's version of events, claiming that during the board's conference call, microphones were muted and dissenting voices were shut out. According to him, the vote wasn't just disputed, it was silenced. Those claims were soon echoed by Representative Joyce Beatty, an ex officio member of the Kennedy Center board who went even further. She accused leadership of outright censorship, saying she was muted and blocked from voicing her opposition. Even more troubling, she alleged the renaming wasn't even listed on the meeting's agenda, meaning members weren't given a fair chance to debate it at all. At that point, this stopped looking like routine political disagreement. It became a transparency controversy. Questions surfaced about process, power, and whether decisions were being pushed through quietly, then labeled unanimous after the fact. And just as those accusations gained traction, another argument emerged, one that could stop everything cold. And then came the line the Kennedys made clear they wouldn't cross: the law. Joe Kennedy III stepped in with a blunt reminder that cut through the noise. According to him, the Kennedy Center isn't just a building that can be renamed on a whim. It's a living memorial established by federal law, created to honor a fallen president. He drew a comparison that instantly reframed the debate. Renaming the Kennedy Center, he argued, would be no different than slapping a new name on the Lincoln Memorial. In other words, this wasn't about opinions or politics. It was about whether history itself could be rewritten by power. That argument struck at the heart of why the center is considered untouchable. It exists not as a brand, but as a national symbol, one meant to outlast administrations, trends, and grudges. For the Kennedys, this was about preserving legacy. For Trump and his supporters, it was about authority and visibility. As this legal and symbolic battle played out in public view, the family itself chose a very different response. As the political noise grew louder, the Kennedys made a deliberate choice. They didn't engage. There were no rebuttals to Trump's posts, no counterattacks, no public sparring. Instead, the family's online presence stayed focused on one thing: grief. Maria Shriver's tribute to Tatiana cut through the chaos with raw emotion. She wrote about heartbreak that made no sense, about a young woman who loved life and fought to hold on to it. There was no anger in her words, just loss, disbelief, and love for a family shattered in public view. The contrast was impossible to miss. On one side, mocking language and political jabs. On the other, messages of remembrance and mourning. That gap spoke louder than any response ever could. By choosing silence, the Kennedys let the moment speak for itself, and in doing so, turned absence into a statement. As the political noise kept escalating, the Kennedys made a choice that stood out even more than a response would have. They didn't engage. No rebuttals, no subtweets, no public sparring with Trump or his supporters. Instead, their focus stayed firmly on mourning, and nothing else. Maria Shriver's tribute to Tatiana captured that tone perfectly. Her words weren't defensive or political. They were raw and aching, describing a young woman who loved life deeply and fought to hold on to it. She spoke about confusion, heartbreak, and standing beside Caroline Kennedy in unimaginable grief. It was deeply human and unmistakably real. Placed next to mocking posts and online jabs, the contrast couldn't have been sharper. One side was speaking in outrage and provocation. The other was speaking in loss and remembrance. That difference did more than any argument ever could. By saying nothing back, the Kennedys let the moment speak for itself. And that contrast may be exactly why this story exploded. And that contrast may be exactly why this story exploded.